Welcome to part 2, where we discuss some of the similarities and differences between children and adult learners. First of all, let me say this. There are many parts of the world where the educational system has quite some history and thus is firmly institutionalized. It may be the remains of an old colonial power, or it may stem from more recent but by now old concepts of society. It can also be developed as part of an advanced welfare society. This can sometimes be a burden. Why? Well, if the educational system was built to respond to the needs of an industrialized society, for example, it may not be fully fit for purpose anymore. The curriculum may be outdated, the methods old-fashioned, the rules and regulations stifling. And besides, the idea that you should learn as a child and then work for the rest of your life is simply not true anymore. Furthermore, there is a global trend where the so-called simple jobs, that is to say, jobs that require no or little formal training, is disappearing. The production of goods is global, and globalization will only increase, not decrease. This disrupts many industries and forces very many to change the way they work or look at work. So first of all, more and more jobs require skills, like for example ICT skills. Secondly, the work is not static, and as a worker you increasingly need to make fluid decisions, react to change, improvise and create. Shifts in consumer behavior, global trends and global competition is also affecting what is being produced, how and by whom. This means less security at work, as companies are not eternal. Now, this is not true everywhere on the globe, and it is not true in every type of job. But if the changes we see in Europe is anything to go by, my guess is that we will need to take a long, hard look at our education system and make some tough choices. Be that as it may, we are talking here about adult education, not the whole system. I simply wanted to point out that there may be a need for reform and change within the whole system. Also, depending on what type of schools, pedagogy and curricula is dominant where you live and work, your work as an adult educator will be affected. If you live in a system with old-fashioned and rigid curricula and an emphasis on skills and competences aimed at the classical industrialized society model, for example, it may mean that you as an adult educator must help people to unlearn some attitudes. And you're also likely to have an uphill struggle when trying to introduce concepts of co-creation, teacher as facilitator, reflective practices, and group-based learning, for example. Because if your learners have grown up with a particular type of pedagogy and teaching, they are likely to expect more of the same way when they enter your class. And while this may be extra challenging for you, the whole thing also offers some interesting opportunities. Your way of teaching, of setting up class or engaging your learners can, if done well and successfully, also help your learners to obtain some of those hard-to-get but increasingly important skills of flexibility, relearning, upskilling, co-creation, and so on. That in turn can only happen if you work as an andragogue and not a pedagogue. So I keep saying that, but what does it mean? Well, adults are different than children, and they learn differently. That is why teaching adults cannot be reduced to the same methods, techniques and principles that you use when teaching children. You should base your selection of learning methods and technique on the psychological, social and learning characteristics of adults. Easier said than done. Making the education interactive is central in a didactic model of the education process where interaction between student-educator and student-student is decisive. Why? This makes the process of learning an active construction of competence for adult students. To do this well, you need high educational and didactical competences as an adult educator, with a special emphasis on group dynamics and methods. Unfortunately, it is not easy to grab a single method and start using it. As with so many other things concerning learning, there are simply too many variables to consider. That is why it is almost impossible to even offer a detailed review of the rich diaspora of adult learning forms, methods, and techniques here in this video. This is truly a case where one size does not fit all. In addition, every learner is an individual and should be treated as one. So yes, we have a challenging job. But there are some things that adult educators can and should always keep in mind. The methods should be appropriate to the learning content. There is no use for a bells and whistles methods that does not fit the learning content. As each learner is unique, you also need to consider each student's learning characteristics, and while you teach a specific subject, you're also promoting values. Thus, the method should support those values, not work against them. Methods including or supporting collaboration, co-creation, and reflection are, for example, better suited for adults than methods based on competition, exclusion, and top-down approaches. This is not all. Of course, you also need to adjust your methods and techniques to fit with the stated learning objectives and learning outcomes. So you are not completely free of outside demands and expectations when you design your training. I know, this is a lot to take in at one time, and sometimes it may seem the list of external demands are endless. I do not want to burden you with even more things to have to keep in mind on top of everything else. To help you, here is a short checklist that covers most areas. Reflect and then select an appropriate learning method or technique. Before you start, anticipate the likely learning outcomes of this method or technique. Consider what level of prior knowledge, skills, and abilities the learner need to be able to benefit from your selected method or technique. Think about what time, space, and materials you need to implement the method and technique you select. Consider what method or technique is providing the most efficient and economical realization of the learning objective. Prepare your presentation to the learners of the method or technique you have selected. It is not enough to select one, you also need to explain why and how, thus motivating the learners. Educational professionals generally agree nowadays that the teaching process should be focused on developing responsible and independent individuals, capable of critical observation and decision-making, responsible for their own learning and career paths. To sum up, andragogy is focused on learning, not teaching, active, not passive learning, placing the learner, not teacher, in the center of the learning process, enabling students to take responsibility for their own learning, practical use of information, not theorizing. Traditional pedagogical approaches in teaching, on the other hand, often include teacher has the final word, teacher is the center of the learning process, students are passive observers. Students aren't allowed to state their own opinion because it's not in the book. Students' needs and abilities aren't taken into account. That sums up part 2 of this section. Did I provoke you? It is obvious I have simplified a very complex field in my attempt to describe differences. If you disagree, reflect on why. How is learning seen and understood where you work and live? Please feel free to add your comments here in Curriculum Globale. You will find instructions on where and how to comment and discuss this and all other lectures in the instruction manual. The next part, Part 3, describes some basic educational terminology. But before you jump there, take a break. Let this presentation sink in. Exercise your brain a bit. And, if you feel up for it, complete another task in the task sheet available for this part. See you in the next part.